Welcome to Inside the Mavs. Kevin Gray, Mavs insider for 105 to the Fan, joined as always by my partner, Grant Asseth of DallasBasketball.com, covering the Mavericks for Sports Illustrated. Appreciate you joining us on our latest episode here. Got a lot to get into today. Make sure you give the podcast a 5-star rating, write a review while you're there. You can also download the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts for free. Somebody had hit me up, say, Kevin, can you put the podcast on Google Podcasts? Well, I got you covered. It's on Google Podcasts as well, so you can get it wherever you get your podcast for free. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports. You can find Grant on Twitter at Grant Asseth. Got a lot to get to on this Monday episode. Grant, what's going on? How you doing?
Well, I'm doing pretty well. I'm looking forward to talking about a lot of different things. It seems like there's a lot going on for sure.
Definitely a lot going on, as over the weekend, a lot of news with respect to Kyrie Irving, Deandre Ayton, even some Mavericks assistant coach news even coming down right before we started this episode here. So a lot we'll touch on here in this episode of Inside the Mavs. Really appreciate all of you who have downloaded the podcast. Over 500 downloads of the podcast already. So really appreciate the support there. Tell your friends, your family, come join the Inside the Mavs family and download and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get podcasts free. So let's jump right in. Finishing up from the NBA draft combine that took place this past weekend. A lot of rumors, news, quote unquote, if you will, coming out from the combine. Let's start with the one that was making the most noise over the weekend, Grant, and that is from Bleacher Report's Eric Pincus, who put together his piece on what NBA insiders are dishing on when it comes to Kyrie Irving and what he may be wanting to do, or what the Mavericks may be wanting to do from a contract standpoint. And I'll just read it verbatim here just so that everyone kind of gets an idea. Now, he was talking about what he was hearing from the NBA draft combine when it came to Kyrie Irving and a possible contract. He said, quote, from one source that he talked to, I heard they had a handshake deal before the trade with the Brooklyn Nets, and Kyrie wouldn't have said yes to anything less than the max. He talked to someone else who had said, quote, maybe to Dallas he is. I'm not sure what the market is for Kyrie, but no one with cap room is giving it to Kyrie when it comes to the max. He comes with too much drama, another source told Pincus. And then finally, another one, a player agent, had said, quote, that they had heard that he's going back to Dallas on a 3+1, which is a player option on the 4th year. His contract would line up identically with Luka's, one player agent told Pincus, which would total around $210.1 million. So, Grant, a lot to digest there, obviously, to start off with. First of all, the idea that Kyrie may have had a handshake deal in place before coming to the Mavericks, to which you say what, based on having read this and started to digest it a little bit?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of conversations that go on, around the NBA that you necessarily wouldn't say fit the, I guess you could say, tampering rules or whatever you want to say. So I wouldn't be surprised. I think that would get into a different conversation about, what potential ramifications if that was like necessarily true. But I do think it would, make the most sense, because no team's going to want to trade for Kyrie Irving, who's about to hit free agency in the summer, without having a strong idea of what, he's going to want in terms of a contract. And, if they're willing to give it to him, especially because he's got to be careful with his bird rights. That's a big motivational factor that went into the trade. He wanted a 4-year deal from the Nets, and, they didn't want to give a fully guaranteed, max without stipulations for, like, games played or winning a championship, things of that nature. And so, if those are your concerns as Kyrie Irving, you're going to want to make sure that you're not going to have those same concerns when it comes time to discuss, like, the serious conversation, for your contract with that next team. And so, as an organization, the Mavs, we're pretty comfortable with tanking, the last 2 games, sitting a lot of key players, getting fined $750,000. To me, I think if I was comfortable with my outlook to re-sign Kyrie, whether I had a handshake agreement or not, I think I would have to be confident to tank the last 2 games, because a 31-year-old has won an NBA title. I don't think he necessarily would want to re-up, long term without already kind of having that idea of what the long-term vision is. If you're basically going to be, pulling the plug 2 games in, that's kind of the opposite of where, probably a 31-year-old would want to be. So yeah, just like kind of just looking at everything, it would make the most sense based off like kind of the behavior of how they approach things.
Yeah, because it would make sense for Kyrie to be on board with the decisions that were made toward the end of the year if you felt comfortable about his ability to re-sign. Now, for folks who, forgotten, he is eligible for a 5-year, $272 million contract based on what we believe the salary cap is going to be going into this upcoming year, around $134 million. I did find it interesting, though, that one player agent suggested the idea of a 3+1, with the 4th year being, a player option for him to line up his contract with Luka. Now, this would be ultimately, Grant, a doomsday scenario where, let's say, with Luka Doncic, who's under contract through the 26-27 season, can't opt out the 25-26 season. If you were to line up those contracts in tandem with one another, and let's just say, again, for doomsday example, you don't have the kind of success that you ultimately want, getting deep into the West Finals, making maybe an NBA Finals appearance, you're looking at a situation where both of them could possibly walk in the same year after that particular season is over with. Now, again, I don't believe that would happen. I'm not saying that would happen, but that would be a very interesting, scenario there, having them both line up and then potentially both walking at the same time. I don't think that would be something that would make Mavs fans or the organization fairly comfortable in that way, unless they felt sure that Luka Doncic wasn't going anywhere. Would you agree with that?
I agree. And I also think, another kind of like bad scenario, I guess, if you will, that you could kind of put yourself at risk of is Luka asking out in the near future. And then you have Kyrie Irving signed for potentially, like 4 years, but most likely 3 years, because of the way the collective bargaining agreement kind of, impacts with the, TV deal and everything. I can't imagine many players are going to accept player options that are like agreed to now with the way the money will look in the future. I mean, I guess that's too much of a detailed future forecast because Kyrie, isn't your typical, player value and he'll be, 34, 35 at that time. So I guess that, that's not what we're really focused on for sure. But yeah, I think there's a lot of different risk management things that you'd have to kind of take into consideration kind of both ways with that for sure.
Yeah, and if I'm Kyrie, I'm at a situation where, as you mentioned, 31 years of age, going to be 32 next year. This is probably my last big contract. So I'm looking for as much financial security as possible. And if I'm going to be in a position where I get a max, whether it be the 4 years or the full 5, the Mavericks have kind of put themselves in a position by what they gave up relative to their future that Kyrie is going to pretty much get what he wants in this situation. At least that's the way it appears, unless there is some kind of back and forth between Nico Harris and his front office about maybe some reservations that they have about Kyrie possibly asking out. But I think based on the way I looked at this team, the way that they talked about him, this as well, covering the team throughout the course of the year, they did everything that they could to ensure that he is, quote unquote, celebrated and not just tolerated, like he is used in his own words, within this organization, that I think all signs point toward him coming back to this team based on what we know. It's just, we never know, which gets me to Brian Windhorst of the Hoop Collective put out a very unique scenario when it came to the Los Angeles Lakers and Kyrie Irving services. Now we know the Los Angeles Lakers are about to get put out of the Western Conference Finals because the Denver Nuggets are just steamrolling them right now as we record this. We record this on Monday, and the Nuggets take on the Lakers later on tonight. It's expected this series is going to be over rather quickly based on what's happened so far. But Grant, the scenario that Windhorst puts out is the Lakers being down 0-3. Could this make it even more of a possibility that Kyrie joins the Los Angeles Lakers? What was your take based on what you saw and listened to from what Windhorst was kind of describing, and kind of describe what your take was seeing from that?
Yeah, I think his kind of read of the situation is that when they kind of face a negative outcome or like, a desperate situation, if you will, they become more willing to kind of take those sort of risks based off like the Russell Westbrook trade. I think that's kind of his thought on there. But the logistics of acquiring Kyrie, keeping Austin Reeves, I think that he mentioned it would require probably sign and trading like Rui Hachimura elsewhere or just rescinding cap holds. I'm assuming that, that part, because logistically it would take a big pay cut for Kyrie to kind of satisfy the hard cap and keep some of those other players as well. So I think he was kind of speculating about like, okay, so the Lakers are kind of stuck. Like they saw, quite a few of their players that, were kind of celebrated as their helpful depth pieces ended up not being contributors during the series. So then that kind of naturally will put a position to question like, okay, so what's next? Like, is this our hard ceiling? LeBron, he's only going to, continue to decline. What will we need to necessarily get us over the top? And I think that's kind of where that speculation is at. And if the Lakers get swept, then, it's like you're not really close to making it out of the West if that's your reality. So I think that, that's kind of where I think he's coming from on that one. I think some people kind of took it as like, like more so like definitive reporting, which is why I feel like he, makes his comments about aggregators for sure. But yeah, I think if you just take it for what it is, and I guess if you have to really like dig in the numbers, it would take I would say a pretty decent pay cut below the max for Kyrie to facilitate, which, that gets us into a different conversation for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure for a lot of Mavs fans, they're sick of the Lakers being in the spotlight, even with them being down 0-3 in this series, and the idea that Kyrie Irving could maneuver his way to Los Angeles. But he is in a spot where he does hold the leverage here, where, look, if he says that he wants to go somewhere, the Mavericks will either have to decide to cooperate with him or risk losing him for nothing, because he can go wherever he wants to in unrestricted free agency. But if there's a destination where he says, look, get me to Los Angeles, get me to Phoenix, facilitate a sign and trade for me to get there, then they'll need to try and figure out the best package to be able to get something done there. I did find the report, or his scenario that he created there a little much, given the logistical nightmare that it would take to try and make all that happen. And more importantly, if you're the Lakers, you've got some young players with Hachimura, Jared Vanderbilt, who hasn't obviously been great in this series for the Lakers, Austin Reeves, who really has been their third best player in these playoffs. It would be difficult for them to move on from some of those guys. Now, D'Angelo Russell, on the other hand, unfortunately has been virtually unplayable in this series so far between the Nuggets and the Lakers. I mean, there's been times where he's been really good in these playoffs, and then this series, he has been basically made to be obsolete based on what the Nuggets have presented so far. So even let's just go down this road real quick to satisfy Windhurst in his scenario. What would you want to see back in a possible sign and trade with the Los Angeles Lakers if Kyrie says, look, I want to go play with AD and Bron, get me there, figure it out? And what would you want to see back from the Lakers in that scenario?
Yeah, I think, just based off of like the salary that they would have to send out to match, I think you would have to see like Mo Bamba, Malik Beasley, like those expiring salaries as a kind of a requirement, whether you kind of want them or not. I think beyond that, it gets complicated because they don't really have too much salary to add. Like Jared Vanderbilt makes around like I think $4.3 million next season, if I remember correctly. That's not like a big push to kind of help you salary match. But that is a player that, for, the Mavs needing to improve defensively, that I'm sure, despite the shooting limitations, could be a helpful piece. If you're in a scenario where you're committing to making such a trade, I think that would probably be what you would want. And then, beyond that, I think, if your mathematics work for getting like a, sign and trade yourself with like Rui Hachimura or something, if they got really creative with like maneuvering salary cap, all that stuff, it would kind of be a requirement to do that. And you'd have to have Rui want to come to Dallas. But I think that could be an interesting scenario to kind of make it, easier. I think that would be potentially more appealing than, paying probably what D'Angelo Russell wants. Because that's a big reason why he even ended up with the Lakers, is that he basically was like, Minnesota can't afford me. I know that. So let's get me somewhere where, they could probably be willing to pay me and make it work. And, of course, things change after the playoffs and all if you don't play that well and, pivotal moments. But, I think there's plenty of, combo guards out there that you can kind of pursue, as opposed to getting a long-term deal done with D'Angelo Russell in a double sign and trade. So I think, if you take those like impending free agents like Russell and, Hachimura off the board for pieces that you can kind of evaluate, I think if you can get any sort of, future draft pick, or even like whoever they draft, I doubt you can get like the late teens pick, but that's probably what I would ask for. Ideally, if I like the prospect that they took, there would be a whole lot of tampering required. That's why that's probably not really even a realistic option. But I know they have a future first round pick that they can use. But yeah, like that's probably my general thought, is like you have to include Bamba and Beasley for salary, and I would want Vanderbilt and try to get a future first, is probably my general thought.
Yeah, because if nothing else, you create some financial flexibility with the expiring contracts. You're able to get some type of wing depth in terms of defense, Jared Vanderbilt, and then maybe a future asset to be able to help you out down the road to try to recuperate some of the stuff that you've been losing over the last several years, to maybe make some deals and flip some stuff going forward there. That, to me, that's where I feel like where the Mavericks are when it comes to not just the remaking of this roster. What can you do to create some kind of capital in terms of rebuilding some of that? We've talked about it before. This team doesn't have any second round picks for the next 7 years. You've got to have some kind of capital coming back in at some point to be able to replenish what you've been giving out over the last several years. And maybe that could be a deal that happens in that way. Speaking of, of deals, we'll touch more on the Kyrie Irving situation a little bit later on. Deandre Ayton was back in the news again. Mark Stein, longtime NBA reporter and insider, does his work on Substack these days. In one of his latest pieces, discussing the idea of what he's hearing about Deandre Ayton and possibly coming to the Dallas Mavericks. And he is saying, quote, that the interest in Deandre Ayton at this point is, quote unquote, overstated based on what he's hearing across the league. Now, for those that don't know, Deandre Ayton, Luka Doncic, part of the same draft class. They both share representation in Bill Duffy, and Deandre Ayton may be looking for a change of scenery given what's happened to him over the last couple of years. And it's interesting, Grant, because one person told me, who I spoke to over at the Mavs, said, look, his rep right now around the league isn't great. Offensively, there would be some fit there with Luka Doncic. But at the same time, trying to figure out whether or not, as they told me, whether it's on Ayton or whether it's on his circumstances over the last couple of years in working in Phoenix. And they would want to get him in there to figure out from an IQ standpoint, emotional standpoint, where he's at, to see what kind of fit, he would be there. What are you kind of hearing when it comes to the Ayton front? And what are you thinking about when it comes to, what Stein is talking about in terms of the overstated nature on whether or not Ayton would be a fit or want to be a part of the Mavericks here?
Yeah, I would say very similar to what you described. I think, when you look at the Suns and Ayton situation, I think there's been some obvious disconnect with Monty Williams and Ayton. And, Williams has obviously since been fired. But I think those kind of concerns go deeper than just the head coach. I think a lot of times, Ayton's kind of wanted more involvement with the Suns. They add Kevin Durant. That makes it harder to keep him engaged offensively. I think if you're the Mavericks, you want a big man that takes pride in kind of setting the tone defensively and doing the dirty work, as opposed to being like, all right, well, we have to work here to get, some touches here, some shots we may not necessarily want to keep him engaged. That's a lot of money on 3 years remaining of a 4-year max to kind of have those stipulations. Kind of thinking about a player of that, kind of with that kind of mentality, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And with Luka, you can definitely make the most of Ayton's pick and roll ability. But also, you'd have to be very confident in him making plays out of short rolls because Luka's going to get doubled, and I think we all know that Luka's not going to get faster turning the
Right.
corner. So you are going to have that screener play out of short rolls. So I think that puts him in a prominent offensive role, but being the recipient of that short roll pass. But then again, like, you have to trust him with attacking smaller players. And, there's been a lot of criticism with him at times that he's too finesse based. He doesn't necessarily punish that player like that smaller guard, if you will, with force. He kind of likes to get to a turnaround or a hook, which, he's pretty good at those things. But, I think there's a little bit to be desired left with kind of how he functionally makes the most of his impact to kind of be worth that salary, or whether he's like in a bigger role in Dallas or he's still in Phoenix for sure.
And when you look at what the Mavericks may be able to offer, let's say we go down this road of Phoenix and Dallas working together to put something together to bring Deandre Ayton, which I'm sure for Mavericks fans, some of them are feeling the idea of Deandre Ayton. Others, maybe not so much, given how they have seen Ayton operate over the last couple of years, specifically even last year against them in the Western Conference semifinals. The number 10 pick is obviously would have to be a part of that package if you're going to bring Deandre Ayton in. Now, for a lot of us looking at the assets that the Mavericks have, it feels like Jaden Hardy would be one of the untouchables here in terms of what you're wanting to do from an asset management standpoint, knowing what kind of future the collective bargaining agreement is going to prioritize. Look, if you can get young players in here, that's kind of the way we want you to go with this. But are you willing to include a Josh Green in a possible deal with the Phoenix Suns? Or is that another one of those obviously young developmental pieces that you say, look, between Hardy and Green, we cannot move off of these two given what they have started to develop in and what that could mean in terms of how we have to manage rosters, going forward? What would you want to put together in a package like that?
Yeah, I think in general, I think I wouldn't necessarily like in a vacuum. I don't think Josh Green would necessarily fit in that untouchable category for trade talks. But I think it depends on who you're discussing that trade for. Like if you're discussing like OG and Anunoby, for example, I wouldn't consider Josh Green to be untouchable because that's like an upgrade on the wing. You add more size, he can play the four, all that stuff. Like it checks more boxes than necessarily someone of Green's size and comfort level playing alongside Luka and Kyrie kind of showed you after the trade deadline move. I do think though that for DeAndre Ayton, that's a lot to give up for a big that you wouldn't necessarily put in that elite category like a Jokic or Embiid. I think in a sense, if you look at it and you're like, would that be what the Suns would ask for to do a trade? You could say yes, but like would that be the right trade for the Mavs? Probably not. I think you would have to look elsewhere for that center fit. And sometimes that's just the way it is. Like sometimes a trade target just isn't the right one for you for the cost, and you just have to move on to the next sort of idea. And I think if I had to give up the 10th pick and Josh Green, unless I'm actually, even if I am still getting rid of my worst salaries, I probably still would be very hesitant to do that for sure.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about some of the contracts that you would even put in a package like that. We're talking about a Tim Hardaway Jr. who's on a descending contract, a Davis Bertans who is a contract for me that has to be moved off of at some point this offseason as well. The amount of capital that you would be bringing in for DeAndre Ayton, who would be a major question on not necessarily the offensive fit, but whether or not, as you were mentioning, the mentality that would need to be brought on both ends of the floor to justify what you're needing to do. That would be a hard ask for me to give up the number 10 pick to go along with that. I mean, but let's look at it. JaVale McGee didn't necessarily work out here. Maybe you find a way to convince Phoenix, hey, you want that guy back? Like, what would you want to have to try to maybe satisfy that? Because it feels like, and I could be wrong, it feels like right now Ayton's a distressed asset that maybe you can possibly get a little bit cheaper than having to give up the number 10 overall pick. But if that's going to be a part of it, that would be a real tough decision for me if I'm the Mavericks in that case. No?
I definitely agree. And I think that distressed asset kind of label definitely becomes more of a focus with the way the CBA changes. have kind of come. If we were having this discussion, maybe like let's say the same results happened, but it was a year ago, maybe it'd be a little different. But I think with how much of a focus is going to be placed on kind of making the most of your spending, like being efficient or optimizing it, whatever you want to call it. I think it would be very tough to move your lottery pick that you rarely ever have, a young player, and then you're kind of left with a 2027 first as your only tradable, like outright tradable, not including swaps, like first round pick. That's, to me, that would not necessarily put you in the position where you need to be, because you still have to address, like upgrading on the wing, and wings are harder to find than, a serviceable or, good starting center. And, especially for the contract size, I think that's something that really just kind of puts pause, on my thought on the situation, because you have to pay Luka's supermax. And he very much deserves that. Like no question of that. But, Kyrie, you're probably going to pay him a max. And then, so like on top of that, over $30 million for Deandre Ayton for the next 3 years. That's a lot of salary. Like that. Honestly, I think DeAndre Ayton would have to be like an elite anchor, really, really elite anchor. And, just probably, I still probably would be hesitant, even if he was like, of that caliber. But I think people kind of forget, like, he's not necessarily like a shot blocker. He only averages like under one, if I remember correctly, like 0.8 blocks. And that's not necessarily the end all be all for defense, but it's not like he's necessarily like switching, like he's Bam Adebayo or, anything like that. Like there's not necessarily an elite trait defensively that you could like necessarily say is his calling card. And to me, that's a lot of money and trade assets to part. I would probably look elsewhere to kind of find that center for sure.
I know Mavericks fans, they are looking for their Bam Adebayo, because the way that he has been performing in these playoffs, then you saw what he did in Game 3, putting Jaylen Brown in the blender. Like he is so fun to watch, and he does everything on both ends of the floor that I'm sure Mavericks fans look like, yeah, we want one of those. We would love one of those, please, if we could find a way to get.
And the Miami Heat, the way they did it was the draft. So it's like, that's another factor to kind of take into consideration for sure.
It's funny, and we'll touch on that while we're here, because I think that's kind of the juxtaposition we are in here, is the way that it feels like this is starting to go with the collective bargaining agreement. A lot more penalties, a lot stiffer penalties if you're going to be spending a bunch of money to try and keep together your super teams, Golden State, and others who are trying to keep these teams together. It sounds like the path going forward is finding young, cheap talent, being able to draft it, and then be able to home grow that talent to be able to move forward. But Grant, the Mavericks simply aren't in that position, because they've got a 24-year-old who's already been a 4-time first-team All-NBA selection, a guy who is an NBA champion who increases your ceiling offensively, and Kyrie Irving. Granted, he comes back here. You're kind of stuck given what the collective bargaining agreement is trying to ask for and what the Mavericks are wanting to do from a win-now standpoint. How do they thread the needle based on what is looking like is going to be happening down in the next couple of years, it feels like?
Yeah, I think it's definitely easier said than done, but I think kind of what we discussed on that first episode, kind of trying to find some trade opportunities that won't necessarily deplete you of your first-round picks. Like there's teams out there that have too many of, a certain type of player that need to move salary as well, and that also have a need at a different position. So like if you kind of evaluate, who can necessarily need what the Mavericks have to offer, and may have too many of like a wing, like not an elite wing, but just like a serviceable player, maybe you can kind of fill that Dorian Finney-Smith void without having to deplete yourself too much. And I think the same, the center position, there's not necessarily a lot of options that stand out like that, because not many teams are carrying too many centers. Wings has been a thing where, people really wanted to stack up, or front offices really want to stack up on if possible. So that's kind of more of a, like they're more desired, but it's like there's definitely more teams that have too many wings and bigs. But I definitely think that, like as we mentioned, like a Robert Covington type of player, like you're not going to necessarily trade a haul or a big asset or anything to acquire a player like that. But if you if you can identify some of those players that may not be on the best valued of contracts, and you're kind of shuffling around those types of players, maybe that other player could be, of benefit to you more than what you have now. Again, that's easier said than done because, there's a reason why there's certain people who run front offices and we're on podcasts. But yeah, I think there has to be trade scenarios if you're a creative GM out there that don't involve you mortgaging your entire future using first round picks is kind of my thought.
No,
I guess
for
to
sure.
sum that all up for sure.
Yeah, it's funny because it makes you think about a player whose role has been kind of up and down, but when he's played well and had opportunities, has done fairly well. And I'm thinking about a guy like Robert Williams in Boston. He's making $12 million a year. His role has been kind of up and down. At times he's played well, but it seems like he would be kind of the guy, like kind of a bargain, find that you could maybe make something happen with to maybe increase his role. Because I'm sure Williams would be motivated to get to a new situation given kind of some of what's happening in Boston. He's another kind of player that I think of making $11-12 million. It makes sense that maybe you could bring in, maybe to try to make something happen there. I mean, Dwight Powell is an unrestricted free agent now. Maxi Kleber's got an $11 million a year contract extension kicking in this upcoming year. As we mentioned, Christian Wood, not necessarily going to be back with this team. Just trying to find some of that bargain, shopping that you can do. And maybe Robert Williams could be a possible trade target. Is he someone that kind of fits maybe some of what the Mavericks would try to do there, given their limited resources, that can make something like that happen?
Yeah, I definitely think that, with him being a switchable guy, kind of as we alluded to with, Bam Adebayo, I think that from a basketball standpoint would definitely be the type of player you would want. He can catch lobs as well. That's a good type of player, and you're not paying him $30 million per year like a Deandre Ayton. Yeah, like that definitely makes a substantial difference for sure. And I think if Boston kind of faces that financial crunch, because like Jaylen Brown make an All-NBA second team, he's now eligible for a Supermax, and I don't think it's necessarily like guaranteed or confirmed or out there yet that Boston is going to offer it. But if they have to make some changes with their roster at some point, he's probably not someone they would be like top of the list to move, Robert Williams, that is. But that's definitely someone that if you probably present the right trade, I feel like that's not an untouchable guy by any stretch. So I think that definitely would be a good target to definitely consider. There are some health concerns with him.
Sure.
After last year's playoffs, he was sidelined for quite a while and had to undergo surgery. But I think, in general, that's definitely like a good player type to pursue for sure.
Mavericks are kind of in a position where they can't be choosy when it comes to some like beggars can't be choosers in a situation like this, given what they've got to deal with going forward there. So obviously, the Ayton thing is going to continue to be a thing just because of the connection that he has with Luka. The Kyrie thing, I think, is going to obviously be the biggest talking point this summer, given the situations that he could find himself being presented in. I want to ask you this before we move on to some of the coaching news when it comes to the Mavericks. What is your just overall take on how this has been presented so far? We obviously have not heard from Kyrie Irving at all since the end of the season. And we keep hearing things about maybe he had a handshake deal. What could it look like in terms of him making a move to the Lakers? What has been your overall thought on this so far and the way that it's played out at this point, even with the season not being over quite yet?
Yeah, I think my main thought has always been that it would be very challenging for the Lakers to mechanically pull off a trade or sign and trade, I should say, to make it work financially for Kyrie for the price that he's probably going to want. And that only becomes more challenging with how those Lakers role players have played. At the start of the playoffs, you can be favorable of those role players Austin Reeves, Rui Hachimura, and even D'Angelo Russell to an extent for how we played in the regular season. But when you have guys that start making plays like Austin Reeves to close out the Memphis Grizzlies, he was running high ball screens with Anthony Davis while LeBron was like, all right, yeah, no, I'll let him cook. Yeah. I'm just gonna chill on the wing here and watch him go to work. Like when stuff like that's happening, the price is gonna go up. And I know they're capped on what they can offer. Austin Reeves, just because of the way the rules work with his current contract. But still, like Rui's played phenomenal. He's had some halves and quarters where he's, been a big boost to them. And that's not necessarily something you have to account for at the start of a trade. But as you see the results come through, it's very important to keep those players. And Woj, did mention that, Reeves and Rui Hachimura are players that, they're going to prioritize to keep, and rightfully so. So that makes it a lot more difficult when you already have LeBron and AD making so much money. And then you also have to get cooperation from the Mavs like that. Like, I know a lot of people like to say, and it's true that like Kyrie has leverage, and that is very accurate. But at the end of the day, you still, like, the team that has the bird rights for Irving, they have some leverage in that sense. Because that's why partly why they made the trade. Like you kind of box the market out in a sense, is kind of the calculation. And that's why the trade was very important, for the free agent outlook. Because, a lot of teams that are in a space to want a 31-year-old are going to need that cooperation for a sign and trade. So that's kind of my general thought on it. I do think that you don't make the trade unless you are willing to pay like that, like 3
and willing to go to the full max if you need to.
Yeah. Yeah, like that, like if the main reason why he's even available on the trade market is that the Nets weren't willing to accommodate those sort of contract demands or desires, whatever you may call it, like, you have to be willing to meet those yourself, and you're exposing yourself very much to risk if you're and giving up leverage in negotiations if you're a team that has not been able to find that co-star. The talk is that Luka Doncic is a generational talent, and they have to be urgent about putting pieces around him. Like, I don't think it would be that complicated if you're Kyrie to say, hey, look, if you don't pay me what I want, like, how is that going to work out for you?
Exactly.
I was reading some articles and listening to Inside the Mavs, and you guys don't really have that much to make trades for. So I mean,
you do what you need to do. Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's definitely my overall thought for sure.
Yeah, use it or lose it. It's in that case when it comes to Kyrie. Before we get out of here today, obviously, there's a couple things we want to touch on. Mark Stein, also Substack, reporting that Frank Vogel could be in line to be the next assistant for the Dallas Mavericks if he does not land one of these coaching jobs. And we are getting reporting from Wojnarowski of ESPN that guys like Adrian Griffin, Kenny Atkinson, and one more name, I forget the name off the top of my head, that's going to be the 3 finalists for that Milwaukee Bucks job. So Frank Vogel not going to be one of those 3 finalists for the Bucks job. Vogel, who worked, of course, alongside Jason Kidd when they were in Los Angeles with the Lakers winning a title together in the 2020 bubble. That name, Grant, makes a lot of sense given not just what we're hearing from Mark Stein and the connection that they have, but you obviously having observed something very interesting throughout the course of the season when it came to Frank Vogel, it sounds like.
Yeah, I at the Mavericks practice facility, like especially early in the season, I think I even posted one earlier, like pretty early on when Vogel was at the facility, kind of talking with Nico Harrison, like observing practice, and like talking with Jason Kidd. It's very clear that like there's an obvious relationship between those 2 guys and Jason Kidd. Frank Vogel, I should say. And I think, with the need to add an experienced assistant coach, to kind of be at the front of the bench, I think you need someone that, the current coach trusts. And I think, Frank Vogel would naturally be someone with their prior experience. Greg St. Jean did a lot, to my understanding, as like, the front of the bench. And you kind of have a thin margin for error at this point. Like, especially if you're, like a Jason Kidd who went from the Western Conference Finals to missing the play-in tournament, you have to have a good season next year. Because, when like naturally when there's like championship winning coaches that are getting fired, like a spotlight gets put on you if you're missing the play-in and then you're underachieving the following season. So I think, having someone you trust definitely goes a long way, and, experience like Frank Vogel, A team that needs to improve defensively could benefit from having someone who, like with the Indiana Pacers as a head coach, even not just the Lakers, like he coached, obviously takes personnel, but he coached some, really, really effective defensive teams. So I think, he has some limitations as in terms of like, half court offense. But I do think, if you're needing a lead assistant, that is a great option to have someone who has that track record of getting the most out of a group defensively, for sure.
And the other name was Nick Nurse. So the finalists for the Milwaukee Bucks are Nick Nurse, Kenny Atkinson, and Adrian Griffin. Those three names are the three finalists for the Milwaukee job. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense for Vogel to possibly be the next assistant for this team. Like you said, given the relationship that they have, some of the things that they could work together to be able to try and fix for this team and be able to move forward. But as you mentioned, most importantly, championship coaching experience to be able to help navigate some difficult situations that may come along during the course of the year. It's just going to be interesting to see the roles possibly be reversed with Jason Kidd being the head coach and Frank Vogel being there next to him as his assistant, based on what we know and how the circumstances came to be with Vogel bringing on Jason Kidd in Los Angeles. That was a time for people who remember how all that went down, allegedly, for Jason Kidd and Frank Vogel to be working together in Los Angeles. So a role reversal would be very interesting to see here, but one that makes a lot of sense given what this team needs and they needing a good season. Because I said this to people all the time, this past season was the most amount of step back that this organization could ever do in the Luka Doncic era, because this can't happen again, given the amount of money that you're going to be committing to Doncic over the next several years, what you look like you're going to be committing to Kyrie Irving for however long that is going to be happening around here, and what limited assets that you have moving forward. So bring in as much experience as you need to in order to help out, Jason Kidd, if that is the case. Finally here on Inside the Mavs, before we go today, interesting topic that you had started to come across when it came to Bobby Marks and Jonathan Givony of ESPN discussing what it means for the NBA now, especially as we move toward the new collective bargaining agreement, and why young talent might be the way to go, especially if you're the Mavericks sitting there at number 10 and possibly having to utilize the number 10 overall pick. What did you surmise there?
Yeah, basically Bobby Marks, when he was doing one of those, draft like conference calls with reporters asking questions about their, the team that they cover. Bobby Marks basically said that, like, from his calculation, the Mavs would benefit from, not necessarily rushing to trade the 10th overall pick. They would benefit from, having cheap youth to add, with their development, current like plan with, Josh Green and Jaden Hardy, having a third guy to kind of like start building that next core, like the, around Luka Doncic. He's 24 himself. So it's like, if you have like if you are willing to be patient or able to be patient, you can kind of have a good, like, interesting group of players to kind of build for the long term in that sense. But again, that's not the reality that we always like live in with the NBA. It's like, someone runs into not saying this is the Mavs, but like in general, like the general, like, kind of like thought is that, you run into a little bit of adversity and it's like, okay, let's start the trade machine, it's kind of how it works.
Let's start wheeling, dealing a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. There's always some sort of reaction, whether it's your front office or the player. And you can't have it happen for too long. So, I think, I definitely see the kind of thought there. And if they can afford to be patient, like they know better than anybody else about their own situation. If they can afford to be patient, I think there's definitely a value in that. You can get into all the types of different prospects, and it depends on who's available and whatnot. But I definitely think there would be value in kind of adding a lottery talent that you can kind of build with going forward. And then all of a sudden, like for example, Jaden Hardy, I don't think much was thought about the value add of like in a vacuum, like the second round pick, the 37th overall selection. Like, the Mavericks have to trade back into the second round. Like, I don't think many people necessarily would have thought that. They would have been like, who cares? A second round pick, who cares? But that ended up being a player that we're talking about now, where it's like, should they trade him? He's a helpful piece, going forward. So I think, like that could end up being a conversation with a lottery pick, even like a player that you may not think fits the need. Like, for example, I know a lot of mock drafts have Grady Dick as a player linked at number 10 right now. Like, I know a lot of people will think like, oh, the shooter who's not a great defender, that may not be the best option. But I think when you're building from a multi-year standpoint, like, you may not necessarily plug a need immediately, but also Tim Hardaway Jr., his shooting meant a lot last year. When he was hot, it swung games. And I mean, even like hypothetically speaking, if you're playing devil's advocate, maybe you could say, maybe you have confidence Grady Dick could develop into being that important shooter. And he's a little taller than Tim Hardaway. Maybe you could fit him more comfortably and cleanly next to a superstar backcourt, in year 2, year 3. So, that, like, even things like that need to be taken into consideration if you're, viewing it from a front office lens. A little more patience than necessarily like, we had to get better on defense. How does this lottery pick immediately fix our defense?
Yeah, because ideally you want to be able to build to the draft, build young talent, sign that talent, and then be able to flip assets as you're able to bring in veteran guys to be able to help supplement what you're building in terms of a roster. So it's very interesting that that's how some of this conversation is starting to turn as we get deeper into the summer and closer to the NBA draft. We'll be looking at different prospects as well, some that fit into that 8 to 10 range that we're going to be looking at as far as the Mavericks, if they decide to keep that pick, and who could be there and available, doing some breakdowns and figuring out who would be the best fit based on what is available in around that 8 to 10 range for the Dallas Mavericks. That can give, hopefully, Mavericks fans a better idea of what to possibly be looking for if they keep that pick. Grant, tell the folks where they can find you and what you're doing these days, sir.
Yeah, for sure. You can find all my written work on DallasBasketball.com. I'm going to be breaking down, quite a bit of draft prospects. We'll have a lot of coverage in general on there. Like, in case people missed it, I was able to ask Nico Harrison a couple questions. We talked about that on episode 1. I did a write-up as well, where he kind of basically, was asked about the trade rumors involving the 10th pick, and made it, a GM will naturally like make it sound like all options are on the table, of course. But, he basically said a comment along those lines. So things like that, that pop up throughout the off season, we'll have a lot of written stuff up there for sure.
And you can find him on Twitter at Grant Afseth. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports. I'll have reports and news from time to time when it comes to this Mavericks team. Always trying to keep my ear to the ground, keeping up with the latest on what's going on with this team. And it's going to be a busy next few weeks here as we start to wind down the rest of the NBA season with the Heat. And the Nuggets look like going to be in the NBA Finals. We're getting closer to the end of the season, which means all focus will be turning to the offseason, what should be a busy one for the Mavericks. Again, you can find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts for free, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Just search Inside the Mavs. While you're there, give it a 5-star rating, write a review for the podcast. The more 5-star ratings that you give it, the more it's recommended for all Mavs fans and MFFLs who would love this team and want to talk about this team. We'll be back a little bit later on this week. Send in your questions. We may have a little Mavs mailbag for you as well. If you got some questions, we'll answer some of those here on the podcast as well. So you can tweet those at Grant Afseth, at Kevin Gray Sports, and we'll be able to select some of those and maybe answer some of those questions on our next episode of Inside the Mavs. So again, appreciate all of you joining us. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can hit the subscribe button as well. Go subscribe to Grant's channel at Grant Afseth on YouTube. You can subscribe to my channel on YouTube at Kevin Gray Sports. Hit that subscribe button, get notifications when the videos drop, and we'll talk to you here in a few days. Again, this has been Inside the Mavs. Kevin Gray, Grant Afseth here on Inside the Mavs. We'll talk to you later. Peace.